Hi, I'm Terry Bonoff, the CEO of Jewish Family and Career Services. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. You are really in for a treat as we welcome David Sheff. David is the author of Beautiful Boy, which then became a film. This book and film chronicles the story of his son, Nick, and their journey together as Nick battled addiction. Thank you to our presenting sponsors who have made tonight possible, to Caring Atlanta, to Twin Lakes Recovery Center and Willing Way, and then so many of you who are with us tonight are also sponsors and are the reason why we can deliver the program that we're going to deliver, not just tonight, but each and every day, the HAMSA program. HAMSA stands for Helping Atlantans Manage Substance Abuse. HAMSA is part of our clinical practice at JF&CS. At JF&CS, we offer a wide array of services. We have emergency financial assistance, a kosher food pantry, we have a clinical practice, we have 7 group homes where people with intellectual and developmental disabilities live, as well as a day program to support them. We offer career services. HAMSA is an integral part of our clinical practice because we know that people who are battling addiction need support. And during this pandemic, it is tougher than ever. Those who face challenges with depression, with addiction, with mental health challenges really do need support. So thank you for being with us tonight. Let us all come together, learn from David and from each other so that we can make sure to address the needs of our community.
You'll hear the term a lot that addiction is a family disease, and it absolutely is.
My addiction affected my family in ways that I'm still learning. I know that was probably devastating for them, really frustrating to have their son just destroying his life in front of their eyes.
When Jacob's mom reached out to us, she was really desperate. She had seen one of our ads in her synagogue newsletter. She said, my son's been through treatment several times. It's just not working for him. He has relapsed again, and our resources are tapped out. I just knew in my gut that No Longer Bound was the right place for him.
When I found out that that was my option and was kind of presented to me as like my only option, I wasn't really in a place to fight anymore. I had like no fight left in me.
No Longer Bound is a model that is 12 months, and they call themselves a regeneration program because they really are about regenerating and healing.
They do present themselves as a Christian organization, as a faith-based organization.
And I called them and I said, listen, I've got this Jewish client. How are you going to be able to work with him to make this program workable? Because I know this is the right place for him.
Yeah, it was different than anything I've really ever experienced in like a rehab place.
To see somebody who was on the verge of giving up to now be 15 months on the other side of that and in such a good place and healthy and really with a great chance at long-term recovery it's a miracle. It
made me believe that maybe I could have a different way of life. So at this point, I've graduated the program. I'm pursuing a CAC, which is a certified addiction counselor.
That's the goal here, not just to help people get well, but to show people it's possible to recover, that you can live a wonderful, fulfilling, happy life. And people need to see someone who's been in their shoes, who's walked their path, do that so they know it's possible for them. And that's what I see in Jacob.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. I'm Leslie Lubell. I am the program manager for the HAMSA program, which stands for Helping Atlantans Manage Substance Abuse. We're part of Jewish Family and Career Services, as our wonderful CEO, Terry, told you about. And we are so grateful to be here with David Sheff, the author of Beautiful Boy. Hi, David.
Hi, Leslie. It's so nice to be here. And I just want to say I'm really an admirer of you and the work that HAMSA does. We need more of you around the country to help people who are suffering. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know everybody just got to see a video about a really special client who means a lot to me, which is our friend Jacob. And that video really demonstrates what we do and kind of what our focus is and why we're here. And I think because our program tonight is called Addiction and Families, a Conversation with David Sheff, that's really a good example of what families are going through, is that they don't know what to do, they don't know where to go, and we need support that really is for them. And the great news is that Jacob has continued to flourish. He is now, we made that video a year ago. And he was 15 months in recovery then. He's now another year in recovery. He's almost finished with his certified addictions counselor certificate. He is working in a treatment center now. He is, he's doing really great. So we're thrilled to see that by driving people towards the right treatment, it really can demonstrate an incredible level of success. So we're excited about that. All right.
That's wonderful. It's a good message for people to hear, because a lot of times when we're in the middle of this, we're sort of in the throes, we don't think it's going to get better. We don't think it's possible. And so when we see a story like that, we know that absolutely it is possible. Not necessarily always easy, and sometimes it takes time, but recovery is absolutely possible for, the person who's addicted and also the family.
Yeah, I think, I said in that video that we have to tell stories like that. Both for the people that are suffering and their families. And I think you're right, because otherwise people lose hope. So we're thrilled. So I want to say a couple of things before we get started. First of all, I have to thank our sponsors, Caron Atlanta, Willing Way in Statesboro, and Twin Lakes Recovery Center in Monroe, Georgia. I am very choosy about the organizations that I work with, and these are three organizations that do great work for people, helping them get into recovery. So we're very grateful that they made this possible. And I also want to make sure and tell people that if you or someone you love is struggling with addiction right now, you have a lot of resources. If you're in danger, if you're a danger to yourself or others, you always need to call 911. In Georgia, we have the CARES warm line that you can call at 1-844-326-5400, and that's going to be up in a couple places, so you can find it later. And you can always call, you can reach out to the crisis text line at 741-741. It's free, it's confidential if you want it to be. They're always available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I want to make sure people know where they can go. So I'm such an admirer of yours, David. I don't know if it's possible to fangirl over an advocate, but I definitely do. And you were an accomplished journalist and author long before you wrote this book. And I know that it started as an article in the New York Times Magazine. And I've read some things about what you expected the response to that article to be versus what actually happened. And so I was hoping you could share a little bit about that with us as a parent and a writer.
Yeah, well, when we fell into this, when my son became addicted, and I just didn't know if he was going to make it. One of the problems that I faced, which is what I think most people who face addiction face, is the stigma. This idea that if something else was going on in our family, we would talk about it. But with addiction, sometimes there's shame and sometimes there's guilt, so we keep it hidden. So I was reluctant to write about it, but I felt that there was maybe an obligation to do that, to share our story. And I expected some blowback, some criticism, you must be a terrible father, your son is addicted, whatever. And it was the opposite. It was just an outpouring of love and support and offers of help. But even more extraordinary to me was a connection to so many people who were in exactly the same situations. People wrote over and over again to say a version of, your story is our family's story. And I also have been keeping it hidden. I have not shared it. So it's so good to know that I'm not alone, because we all think that we're alone. And of course we aren't.
So, I got a little bit ahead of myself. And so I'm going to ask you to back up just a little bit. And for people that may not have read the book or seen the film and maybe don't know your entire story, can you give us just a brief background on how we got here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I never would have imagined, really changing my life, to dedicate it to trying to educate about addiction and to, push through policies, because I didn't really think about it. I had an image, like many of us do, of what a quote unquote drug addict looks like. And it certainly didn't look like my son. But I realize now that people who could become addicted look like anybody, all of us, all of our children. And I found that because my son, as a teenager, did become addicted. I was completely blindsided. I didn't realize it was happening until it escalated to the point that it was dangerous. He was in serious trouble of dying, relapsing, or also being in situations that were incredibly dangerous. And at that point, finally, when I acknowledged and saw what was going on and how terrifying it was, I realized I had to do something to try to help him, to try to save his life. And that's when I realized just what a disaster the treatment system is, or at least what we call a treatment system. You know, I was completely out of my mind with worry. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't working. And at that point, I tried to navigate it. I had to navigate a system that was just broken, to try to understand, really, even go back to the beginning. What is it, addiction? What had happened to my son? And I guess because I'm a journalist, you know, I pushed forward to try to answer that question. And through that, I came to understand and finally get him good treatment. But there were a lot of mistakes on the way that we were lucky to survive.
Mm-hmm. So how long was it before Nick was able to get into long-term recovery? How many years was he struggling with addiction?
Oh, it was 10 years of hell. And it wasn't 10 years of continued escalation of drug use, but overall it was. But what would happen is finally there would be a crisis. I would get Nick into treatment. He'd do better. He'd leave treatment, and sometimes he would stay sober for a month, and then he'd relapse, and sometimes, 6 months or a year. And each relapse was worse. Each one was more crushing, I think, to him as well as to me. We got more and more hopeless and more scared. And the fact is that, I didn't think he was going to make it to 21 years old, and he just turned 38. So I feel so lucky and so blessed, and especially at a time when I have met and hear from and communicate with so many people who didn't have the luck that we had, whose kids didn't make it. I mean, we are talking, of course, we're talking about COVID now. It's killing people and it's devastating our communities. But we can't forget the fact that we are losing at least 200 people every single day to drug overdose.
Yep.
So, as I said, it took 10 years, but we were lucky.
So the reason I wanted you to kind of tell that story a little bit is because I think, and as I'm sitting here listening to you talk, there's a million things I want to talk about. I wish I didn't have to keep it so brief. We could have a series, David. That would be amazing.
Okay.
So I have to try to keep it focused. Thank God I have some notes. But one of the things you talked about a lot was that stigma and that shame that really, I think, keeps people from reaching out and asking for help. And I thought that example you used about an illness, right? That when somebody says, how are you? That if you have a child or a spouse or a friend or a sibling who has a physical illness, you might say, they're not doing so great. They're really struggling right now. But when people struggle with mental illness and addiction, people are really afraid to talk about it. And I think one of the reasons our program was created was to address kind of the needs of the Jewish community, specifically around addiction and recovery, and the ways that shame and stigma seem to impact the Jewish community. I know you grew up in a Jewish home. I'm just curious, do you have any experience with that? What is your reflection on that in the Jewish community, if at all?
Well, I think that this idea of stigma goes into our community like everywhere. And it's because, maybe it's a little different in different communities, but I know, at least in my family, and I know other people, from Jewish families, and it's not uncommon to be for there to be a lot of expectations, a lot of, it's kind of the same thing. We're very, very willing to share the stories, the good stories, the play my kid is in, or the, sports award he got, or the, eventually the college they got into. But when we're struggling, we do keep it a secret. And ironically, I think Jewish communities often are the last places that we have to, because there is a lot of support and there is a lot of caring. Yeah. But because, again, being afraid that we're going to be judged and that not keeping up with, the Joneses, it's this, idea that everybody else is doing great, their kids are doing great, because we don't share those stories. And of course, we know that that ultimately isn't true. And I guess it all goes back to this reason. All I was going to say is that it goes back to this reason that if somebody gets an illness, tragic illness like a cancer or a heart disease or something, I mean, there's no blame for that. We sort of know that people aren't responsible when they get sick like that. But it looks like that people who become addicted are making that choice. No one is forcing them. No one forced my son to go out and score, drugs, heroin, methamphetamine, and do those drugs. And to the point that, his family, we were, in so much pain, and he was so close to dying and all this stuff. So it doesn't look like a disease. It doesn't look like other diseases. But part of my research told me that, yes, indeed, the brain changes. People who become addicted, it's different than other people who can drink or do some drugs and don't become addicted. Because this is an illness, it's a disease. And once I realized that, I was able to look at my son in a very different lens. I was able to look at him with compassion instead of judgment. Instead of saying, how could he do this to me? I was, oh my gosh, my son is sick. What can I do? And only then did I start to be open to talk about it with other people. But even then I found, people who were in the middle of it, they got it. But people who weren't, who never had experience with addiction, there is judgment. And about mental illness too. This idea that we are supposed to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and be okay. I suffered myself with addiction. Not with addiction. I've never had that, but I basically have had every other mental illness you could find. I've got depression. I've had have a mild bipolar disorder, and there is an idea that it's a choice. If you're depressed, just pull yourself out of it. Get with it. Stop being so glum or whatever it is. And of course, somebody who has mental illness would do that if they could.
Right. Well, and I also, you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago that, it's bipolar light is, the bipolar 2 diagnosis is kind of what I have that leans more towards depression. And I think it's very, very hard, even for the person with the, stigma impacts the sufferer as well as the people on the other side of it, right? Because then we get caught in the cycle of, well, why can't I change? Why can't I be different? Why can't I pull myself out of this? You're just lazy. You're just, a failure, all those things, because I'm also in long-term recovery, right? So all those things we tell ourselves, and that is all kind of informed also by stigma, which I think is one of the barriers that I think keeps people from reaching out for help, right? Is that we don't even ask for help because we're judging ourselves, right? And so, I think
we don't want to be
important. So let me ask you something.
And another part of the stigma, I was just going to say that another part of the stigma, I think, again, if you had cancer, I mean, that would be horrific, of course, but there are tests that show, and scans and this and that show, you're doing better, but we have to keep treatment. But what happens, at least with me, and I know a lot of other people, is I'll be doing well because I'm actually in therapy and I'm on the right medications, and I'll kind of forget. And I'll think, well, maybe I don't need these medications. Maybe I'm actually, okay. And then all of a sudden I sort of cut down, and my wife realizes that something's happened because UPS is showing up and delivering, 15 packages from, every single day or something like that. I mean, and for some people, of course, the symptoms are, the result is a lot worse. But that's part of it too, is that it is tricky. We don't look at our brains the way we look at the rest of our bodies.
Well, and it's interesting that you said that, because I've really been trying to talk lately about, I don't know why we call this mental illness. Our brain is a part of our physical body, and to separate the two things in that way, it creates a different set of criteria kind of. And really, you can't have physical wellness without mental and emotional and spiritual wellness. Like they go hand in hand. And so sometimes I wish that we could change the vernacular around that. I don't think I'm powerful enough to do that. So I'll focus on the things I can change. But for people listening, just think about that. Think about what it means when we talk about mental health versus physical health. And we could go off on a tangent about parity and insurance, and why we don't have it is because these two things aren't treated as equal. They're seen as different, right? So, all right, so let me ask you something, because you kind of hit on this. You were talking a little bit about what it took for you to be able to see the disease versus who Nick really was, right? And so a lot of times we'll hear, especially in certain types of recovery communities, sort of this personification of the disease, right? It's the disease talking. That's your disease telling you that. You know, there's also kind of some sayings in certain circles of, you know, if you don't take care of your disease, it's outside doing push-ups waiting for you to come back, right? And there's a point in the book where you make I'm going to read this really, really quickly because I think it's so important. You said, the meaning I have come to is that Nick on drugs is not Nick, but an apparition. Nick is a ghost, a specter, and when he is high, my lovely son is dormant, pushed aside, hidden away, and buried in some inaccessible corner of his consciousness. I think what struck me about that is that you're not denying that Nick is still in there and that the disease kind of takes over. And so can you sort of tell other parents, because I think, and we've got some questions we're going to get to at the end of this from some of the people that when they registered submitted some questions, but I think parents have a really hard time accepting this idea of the disease. And so could you briefly tell us kind of how you got there? What was it that sort of helped you get over that hump of being able to say this, that you knew that wasn't your son and that you knew he was in there?
Oh, what a good question. Because it is so baffling. And part of the early stages of this was me asking myself, you know, where did he go? I mean, I knew this kid was this gentle, loving, moral, kind, you know, person, and he was gone. So I thought it just didn't make any sense, and that part of it led to the judgment. You know, again, how could he do this to himself? I know this kid, but one of the things I saw, and I really see it more in retrospect, because in the middle of it, I think I was just trying to survive so much of the time. But I see that as much as it looked like, or at least again, we have this idea of why people use drugs. It's to get high, you know, to have fun, whatever that's what they care about. But when I look back, I realized that Nick was not having fun. Maybe at the very, very, very beginning when he was in high school and he started, when he was partying, whatever, but he was not having fun. He was in pain and he was miserable for 10 years trying to figure it out himself. Why couldn't he stay sober? So when I did this research and I was with some of these, you know, researchers, scientists, addiction specialists who explained to me what happens with the brain and the dopamine system and how it, you know, I used to say, he's out of his mind. He's crazy. And, you know, in a way he was, because his mind was not functioning properly. And when I saw that, I was able to look closer and look deeper into his eyes and realize that he was in trouble, that he was in pain. And he was in there suffering. This was not Nick. This was Nick with this brain disease, who is like someone with, I don't know, whatever, schizophrenia or something like that. I mean, it's not their fault. And it took me understanding that this is a disease for me to realize, you know, another thing that sort of, maybe it's a cliche, but they talk about the brain being hijacked by addiction. And I really think that that's exactly what happens, because one kid who was addicted described it to me as, he said, somebody who does not have this disease, who does not have addiction, can't understand it. But when my brain changed so that it was dependent on drugs to function normally, which is like for somebody else, you know, we need to breathe. And if someone deprives you of oxygen, you will kick, you will scream, you will do everything because you feel like you're going to die. And of course you will if you are deprived of oxygen. He said it feels the exact same way with drugs. If you are deprived of drugs when your brain is dependent on them in that way, in that physical way, you feel like you're going to die. And that's why the behavior that makes it even more confusing, because before it was over, my son, again, this moral, lovely child, was breaking into our house. He broke into other friends of our family's house. He stole checks, credit cards. It baffled me. I mean, it did. He stole from his little brother, and that was maybe the hardest one for me to see, because I knew I knew that Nick loved Jasper, his little brother. I mean, he loved him. He was just the best big brother as they were growing up. He was so devoted, and they were both devoted to each other. And so that was another piece of this puzzle that made no sense. You know, something was going on that wasn't Nick. And, you know, over time I got it, but it's a really hard lesson, but I think it's maybe the most important lesson, both for the parents, for whomever it is, whether it's brother, sister, child, cousin, whatever, and the person who's suffering that, you know, substance use disorder themselves, because Nick was as baffled as I was. He didn't want to relapse. So what would happen? He would get out of a recovery program, be committed to staying sober, and he couldn't. Something would happen, and the next thing he knew, he was using again. And it was not a conscious, oh, I'm going to start using again. It was this craving for oxygen, as this guy described it.
I think that's such a great way to describe it. So I do want to tell people, if they don't already know this, that all this research that you did, you wrote this book called Clean. I love the title of this book, Overcoming Addiction and Ending America's Greatest Tragedy. It almost like makes me cry when I read that title because it's very real. So for people that want to learn a little bit more about addiction in America, this is what I love about this book, is that if you don't feel like reading it from cover to cover, you kind of don't have to. You can pick the sections that are interesting to you, pick it up, put it down, what have you. And there's a lot of really good information in here for people to try to better understand addiction as a disease. So if that's something that families are struggling with, this is a really good resource, and I wanted to bring that up. The other thing, you talked about Jasper just now, and it's so interesting. One of our committee members said to me when I said, hey, I want to dedicate the next year to families, the year of the family, the year of the parent, actually, is what I said. And she said, what about the siblings? She said, they really suffer too. And Jasper and Daisy are such a huge thread that runs through Beautiful Boy. I mean, we can never get all the details from a book into a movie. So if you've only seen the movie, you get just a snapshot of those relationships. I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about, just that sibling relationship when they have a sibling that is struggling with addiction, what that looks like and how you can heal that, and kind of what things look like for you guys now, many years down the road.
You're right. Whoever said to you, let's think about the siblings, was right, because it's easy to forget that, because again, the parents, I was in crisis mode. So I was focused on Nick, trying to help him. And we did our best, Karen, my wife and I did our best to protect Daisy and Jasper and to take care of them and to help them. But still, they were aware that, first of all, their brother, who they loved, was gone and something bad was happening.
For perspective, for the people that might not know, the age difference between them is that at the time Nick was maybe 17 and Jasper and Daisy were how old?
Jasper's 11 years younger, so Jas was 6 and Daisy would have been 4. So they were really young. But remember, this went over for 10 years. So beginning when Jasper was 6, but ultimately he was 16 before Nick finally was in recovery. So there were 16 years that were traumatic for those kids, and there's no two ways around it. And I hear from so many siblings who express something that I think is really critical. First of all, they are suffering. Second of all, they have a piece of this. They experience a part of this that others don't, which is that they are in a family that has been disrupted, and their parents, who are the ones who are, our job is to protect them, to take care of them. We did not do the job that I feel like we should have done, and I wished I had done. I tried, it wasn't that I didn't try, but they were really scared for all those years. They didn't understand it. The other thing that is the emotion that I think that it took a therapist actually for them to finally recognize, and it's something I hear from so many brothers and sisters, is that they also were really angry. And they were angry at their brother, who they also loved, which was really confusing to them, and they were afraid of him. They wanted to see him desperately, but they were so scared of him coming home because something was going on that was beyond their understanding. But they recognized the fact that he was doing something to their family. Again, intentional or not, it didn't matter to these little kids. He was doing something to their parents, in some ways taking their parents away from them, scaring the parents and scaring them. And so finally, the breakthrough came when we did recognize that the kids needed help too. We brought them to a family therapist. And the key moment, of course, it took many, many sessions over the course of years, but the key moment that I remember was that they were with somebody who for the first time acknowledged what they were going through. He said to them, he acknowledged how scary it is when someone in your family you care about and that you love is using drugs and you don't understand it. And he said, I want to tell you something that a word that you may not have heard about before. And the word is ambivalence. And that word means that you can feel two things at the same time, which means you can love someone and also feel almost like you hate them. You can want to see them so badly, but you can be afraid to see them. You can be really angry with them at the same time as loving them. And it was the key breakthrough because nobody was acknowledging that. So you have these two kids, these two little children who are feeling things that they don't know those feelings are normal. And they also are judging themselves for feeling that way. How can I hate my brother? How can I be so angry with my brother? So that was a breakthrough for them and the beginning of therapy that has helped them. And the great lesson that we have to share, which also suggests how lucky we are, is that because of a lot of work, now they're older. Daisy's 22, Jasper's 25. No, he's 26, which sounds like, Nick's,
sometimes.
well, I was going to say Nick's 37. I guess all I was going to, that made me think about is, God, I'm old to have kids that old. But, they adore each other. They're really close. They spend a lot of time together. They go to the movies. Before there was the quarantine, they went to the movies together, but they watch, videos together. Everybody was together when we were quarantined. They surf together. I mean, they're best friends. And so in addition to people who are going through this, who don't feel hope for the person who is using them, whether it's for themselves, I can't do it. I can't stay sober. I can't stay clean. Or the parents or brother or sister or husband and wife, whoever it is. There's also a reason to be hopeful that the family can survive this, and not only survive this, but heal and ultimately be closer than ever. Because I will say that, of course, I wish we didn't go through this. I wish my son didn't have to experience that pain. But when you go through something like this and you come out the other side, you are changed. And we don't take each other for granted. I think we appreciate each other and we appreciate the love in our family and the support we can give each other more than ever, and recognize the fact that, it was trauma. People talk about trauma, they talk about post-traumatic stress. You mentioned earlier this idea that we think about it as an event. Someone is in the war, someone experiences a horrific car accident. But there's a kind of stress that is traumatic that can go on for years and years and years and years. And so even when Nick was in recovery, we weren't finished with that stress. We experienced that post-traumatic stress. And in some ways, I think there are still vestiges of that, and we continue to struggle sometimes. And the good thing is that we have support and we support each other.
I appreciate so much you sharing that piece, though, just about being able to finally kind of reassemble the pieces of your family and to be able to kind of be whole again. I think a couple important things I want to make sure people heard you say, which are, again, two things that can be true at the same time, right? Which is that you can be completely consumed with helping one of your children who needs you, and also make sure the other kids still need you too. And that
and you can take care of yourself as well throughout all that.
But the therapy piece, I think the family therapy piece, finding somebody who understands the dynamics in families of addiction to help the family unit get through that. I think the value of that cannot be understated. And that sounds like it's part of what helped your family and your other kids get through this too.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, that's the other piece. As I said, it took work for us. I feel like, again, without therapy, I resisted going to Al-Anon meetings. I had this sort of, maybe this arrogant or whatever idea that I'm not going to be caught dead in one of those, people were sitting around whining and, eating, bad cookies and drinking bad coffee. But what happened when my wife and I finally did go to one of those meetings, even though it definitely was not enough for me, I needed therapy, but it really was a relief to be with people who got it. They understood. I didn't have to pretend anymore. And they were open about their own experiences, and they were open about the stigma again and the isolation they felt. And I was in a room with parents like me. Everyone was crying, and that was okay. Other places I'd be sitting on the side of a swim meet, of Jasper's or Daisy's swim meet, and I was with all these other parents, and my son was on the streets. I didn't know where he was, and I was dying inside, but I was pretending that everything was okay. I was, cheering, and the other parents were talking about all these amazing things going on in their families, and as I said, I was dying because I didn't know where my son was. So to be in a room where people got it was also a huge part of, it really helped a lot. And I
And we
recommend,
help people
you know,
with
whether it's Al-Anon or whether it's another kind of support group, and they have support groups for parents, a lot of programs include family therapy, group therapy, individual therapy. I think we need it. I think this idea that we can do it ourselves, I mean, maybe some people pull it off, but it's too big, it's too hard.
Well, and there are a lot of ways out there for families to find support, and they aren't just Al-Anon meetings. There's lots of other ways. And so certainly if anybody's looking for that, we can help you find it. You can also look online, but there are lots of ways to connect with other families. And I think from what you're saying, it's huge. It's so invaluable. All right, so I want to ask you about something, and then we're going to try to get into our parent questions, because a lot of the things I want to talk about, these families have already asked. So here we are in COVID. We know that all over the country, I heard the other day on the news, somebody that works with Veterans Affairs saying that there was 1,000% increase in the number of calls going into crisis lines. We know here in the state of Georgia that we've seen terrifying increases in overdoses, particularly fentanyl, that we see increases in the number of people coming into emergency rooms and hospitals and all of this stuff, right? This is a really scary time right now for everybody, and especially people who are already struggling to then be isolated. And we all know, right? So I was thinking about how I've heard people ask in interviews a lot, well, what would you tell other parents, right? So I don't want to ask you a question that you've already been asked 100 times. But what I did notice was you and Nick did a talk about the book that you wrote, High, for teenagers, which is really cool. And you mentioned, you referenced a study with, I think, some prison inmates saying, what do you wish your parents had told you? And they said they shouldn't have told us anything, they just need to listen. Mm-hmm. And you also said in that same talk, something along the lines of, it's our job as parents to help our kids negotiate really tough times in their lives. We have to connect with them and make it safe for them to talk to us. And then the last piece of this is a study where you showed, you mentioned that they asked parents why they think their kids use, and parents said because of peer pressure and because it feels good. And that when they asked the kids why they used, kids said because of stress. Yeah. So you take all those pieces there and look at the environment we're living in right now with COVID. You know, what do you think parents can be doing right now to try to help their kids not turn to substances?
Yeah, we know that stress can lead to drug use. It's one of the things that can lead to, it can contribute to mental illnesses, working, and of course, suicide. It's obvious, turn up the stress and there's more pain, there's more anxiety, and there's more of a need for some sort of solution. And that can mean, for some people, the ultimate, suicide, but it also can mean using drugs in really dangerous and escalating ways. And I think, also need to acknowledge the fact that specifically you mentioned the isolation that's related to the current pandemic. That is a big stressor too, because one of the ways that people go through stressful times is connect with other people. And if that's harder to do now, that's another reason that people are stressed. In fact, one of the reasons for the increased overdose rate, which is dramatic, as you say, one of them is the increased stress. But another one, and I didn't realize this until a doctor told me this, but it's about the isolation of people who use drugs. Because if somebody is using drugs by themselves, they're much more likely to die because they don't have someone with them who can see if they're in trouble, who could administer Narcan to save their life, or who could call 911. So all these things. So the question then is what we can do, as you say. And the first one is to acknowledge that this is happening, and to realize these are not normal times, to realize that people with all kinds of mental illnesses and psychiatric disorders, including addiction, are more vulnerable than others and more vulnerable than ever. And there are options for people who are in need those kinds of support. There are a lot of meetings and support groups that have gone online, which really are good for some people, but it's not enough for some people, because some people really do need that one-on-one human connection. So I think you said it, listen. The idea is, within the constraints that we're living, to be aware that this is a tougher time with people who are struggling, and to be there for them in whatever ways you can. To reach out to people who are alone, to reach out to your kids who are suffering. I mean, your kids can be home, but still suffering because they're disconnected from their friends. They're disconnected from their social lives. So the stress increases. So part of it is to have conversations. And I follow that idea, you know, that these prisoners told me to listen, with this idea that, you know, I thought, and I think a lot of parents think, you know, we are really good at listening, but sometimes we have to learn how to listen better, because we can think we know the answers. You know, we can tell them, you know, this is a really stressful time, you know, you're doing this, you should be doing this. And they can shut down. So if we can learn how to listen, and we can really, really pay attention to what they're saying, and not just the words, but also their body language, how they're functioning, you know, are they, does it seem like someone's more depressed? And then at that point to realize that, you know, the conversations are critical, but sometimes we need to get help to know what to do to help someone else. And that means calling an organization like yours, calling a therapist, you know, encouraging ways to get for kids to connect. And they are doing it online. Or there are now, you know, for instance, some support groups that are being really careful with social distancing and masks and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there are resources depending on where you are and where you live, but the biggest thing, I guess, is not to ignore it, to acknowledge that this is a tough time. Again, it's tough for all of us, but to realize that it's tougher for people with these psychological problems. And I think it's also tougher for kids.
Yeah.
You know, they are confused, not just the isolation, but it's a scary world out there. We're talking about, I mean, you know, it ranges from, you know, the injustice, the racial and social injustices that we're recognizing, you know, to global warming. I mean, you know, to grow up at a time like this, it's overwhelming to everybody. And then if you add on top of that, you know, the temptations and the opportunities to use drugs as a way to mitigate, or at least a way to somehow, you know, numb some of this anxiety, or to lift some of that depression, or at least give a brief respite from depression, then it's no surprise that, you know, people are turning to drugs and that people are overdosing. And you mentioned fentanyl, and the fentanyl is, we talked about it some, but people still don't understand that the danger of fentanyl. And most of the people who are dying now, there's a rise in deaths that are related to methamphetamine again, after that was wrestled down for a while. But fentanyl is still the number one. And what people also don't understand is someone does not have to actively be buying fentanyl to use fentanyl and to overdose on fentanyl. But more and more fentanyl is being mixed with other drugs, with some of the, you know, with methamphetamine, even marijuana sometimes, even heroin. I mean, all these other drugs, which means that a very, very small dose of a drug that may not be lethal otherwise can now be lethal.
Yeah, and that's something we do a lot of education around that. We do a Narcan training, and we're able to provide Narcan through our grant. And one of the things I've really tried to do and educate people about is the risk of fentanyl, because I think, again, this is part of the stigma, which is that the only people that are at risk for overdose are people who are IV heroin users. And that's not true, unfortunately. The drugs that are really popular with kids in affluent upper middle class neighborhoods are pills and cocaine. And those are drugs that are more and more and more coming up laced with fentanyl, because the pills can be produced counterfeit. And we just had here in Atlanta, unfortunately, a huge rash of deaths that were all traced back to the same cocaine that was laced with fentanyl. And so part of that is just this awareness. I read somewhere that the antidote to stigma is education. And so if we can educate people so they understand that, then we can start teaching them how to stay safe. And so with that, I will tell people, if you're in Atlanta and you would like more information about a Narcan training or Narcan, please let us know. We would love to help with that. All right, so I have to move into these questions from these families. They're such great questions. So we're gonna do the best we can to answer as many of them as we can. All right, so it's hard to go so good. I don't know where to start. Okay, so this person said, they asked, how should families, I think this is so good, by the way, how should families approach a younger member of the family who has been sober as a teen and now wants to try social drinking and using in college? This is a huge issue with teens when they get sober because they're so young.
It really is. It's a tough one, and it's really common. Nick, my son, went through that. What would happen is that he very quickly learned that he's in trouble if he uses meth or heroin. But he didn't buy this idea that he could not use any substances. So for a while, It's like, I can just have a drink. And again, going off to college, how's a kid going to navigate college without drinking? Of course, there are alternatives. It's possible. There's support. There are sober dorms. There's all these different things. But Nick didn't know that at first, so he started to drink. And what he learned is that he would have a glass of wine, and then he would have a vodka tonic or whatever, and then he would go out and get drunk, and the next thing he would be at his meth dealer. It was not possible. Same thing with marijuana. I'll just smoke some pot to even the edges off because it is stressful. He does have anxiety disorder. To deal with his anxiety, I can just smoke some pot. He couldn't. Same thing. It would very, very spiral back into that whole addiction mechanism in his brain, the spiral downward, and the dependence again, the need for drugs, and stronger drugs to make him feel okay, even when it wasn't really making him feel okay. It was again this needs that can appear to be a choice that isn't a choice. So part of it, again, education. We're aware of the fact that kids going to college are even again, without addiction, anxiety, depression, it's a stressful time. Kids who've been at home are going off into another environment. They're away from their parents. They might be thrilled to be away from their parents, and they might be thrilled to be starting this new phase of their life, but it is overwhelming and it is scary. They're also in an environment where a lot of times they can't show that or admit that. Mm-hmm. So one of them is to keep in really close touch with your kids. One of them is to establish a non-judging relationship with them so that they can tell you what's going on, not just, I'm trying to drink now. I know that I shouldn't. I know they always said I couldn't drink, but I think I'm doing okay with it. Instead of yelling at them and lecturing them, say, let's pay attention to how that goes forward so they can still talk to you about it without just thinking you're going to freak out and grab them and throw them back into rehab or something like that. So keeping that connection and also helping them connect with support on college campuses. And that means, there are sober living situations on campuses. And there are counselors and therapists, health centers on pretty much every campus. Now there's a whole new tricky thing going on now because a lot of the campuses aren't fully opening, which does not it takes away some forms of stress. I mean, maybe on Friday night, everybody's not going to a frat party or something, getting wasted, and the kids have to negotiate that. But again, new kinds of stresses because of the isolation. How do we navigate that? We really have to stay connected to our kids and encourage them always to get support and to support them getting support, to help them. This idea too that, somebody who's 19, 20 years old is to be able to navigate the mental health care system. It's not realistic. So, depending on, as long as we have a good relationship, we can help them navigate these tough years.
Thank you. I do want to tell people I'm not making any commissions off of these plugs, just saying, but this book is called High, and it was written by David and Nick together. And that's what I think is really cool about this. I mean, listen, it's very appealing to young people. Like the graphics are really cool. But I think the fact that Nick is speaking a lot from his own experience as a teenager, this is really valuable. So I think if there are kids in your life that you're concerned about, maybe you just kind of slide this onto their bedside table and maybe one of these days they take a look at it. I think it can be really, really valuable. Okay, so this is a really important one. My daughter is a heroin addict. I'm drained and it has almost torn the family down. I have a very hard time with tough love. I am no longer giving her money, but I have to contact her every day just to tell her that I love her. If something happens to her and I've not told her that I have not told her that, I don't think I could live with myself. And this isn't really a question, actually. I think maybe this person just wanted to share that, but it kind of begs the question of how do you know where to draw the line? And you talk a lot about maybe moving away a little bit from this idea of letting people hit bottom, but also finding that balance and how we kind of straddle that line. It's a big question, but for somebody who's in a scenario like this mother is with a daughter like hers, and knowing your own experience, can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how do you know where to draw the line?
Well, the first thing I'll say is I'm so sorry. I every time I think, I've sort of like Oh, Nick is doing great. I'm, sort of recovered myself. I talked about PTSD. I realized that I haven't. I mean, I just almost started to cry just hearing that. It brings it all back, and I know how hard it is, and I know how scary it is. And one of the hardest, scariest things for me throughout this was the messages I got. On one hand, I was learning that addiction is a disease, but on the other hand, I was being told that in some ways I was contributing to the disease, contributing to the use, because I was, the word was always enabling, trying to help, allowing them to help, allowing Nick to come home when he was in trouble. I think it is such a dangerous message that we're given. Talk to your child every single day. Tell him or her you love them. Tell them you're there for them to help them get help, and help them, no matter how many times it is. I mean, if they had another disease, you're not going to wash your hands of it and say, do this yourself. It's hard and it can take a long time. But the other part of it that I think is really sort of, it's almost evil, or maybe it is evil, is this idea of telling us that we're not supposed to be parents, because that worry, that concern, that devotion we have to our children, that wanting to help them, being told that that's part of the problem, that that's a bad thing, that we're actually contributing to their problem, it's ridiculous. It's just not true. That said, there's nothing black and white when you're dealing with addiction. It's good you're not giving money, who wrote, because what happens then is if you just give somebody cash, it's likely that, they're going to go out and buy more heroin. And that is not useful. But there's a lot of other ways to be supportive. There was one of the things they told me over and over again was not to let Nick come home, let him on the streets. Well, that's really dangerous. Doesn't mean it's always possible. They might not come home, they might not want to come home, or it may be too dangerous, because some people on drugs, some people on methamphetamine are not safe to be around. But we do not want them on the streets. And so we can do what we can to help them, whether it means coming home, or if not that, getting into another safe place, trying to work toward getting them help, to getting them the treatment that they need. But we should not give up. And we should not blame ourselves for not giving up. And I think that when we hear people tell us that, that I just say, I just think it's a dangerous message. They do talk about you have to let them hit bottom. It's not true. Research, first of all, tells us that a person who goes into treatment, no matter why they go into treatment, even if they're doing it because their parents are bribing them, even if they have an intervention, a positive intervention, a sort of loving intervention, even because if a drug court forces someone, they have an equal likelihood of getting sober and staying sober. But the other thing we know is that if we wait for a person to hit bottom, bottom might be death, or it might be a crime that they're involved in that would put them in prison for, a year or 2 or 5 or 10 or forever. I mean, and that's certainly not going to help somebody get well. So we want to prevent people from hitting bottom. We want to do everything we can to hold them, to catch them. I can't emphasize that enough, because I hear from people all the time who tell me, we've been through the treatment system over and over again. We're told that we have to let go. He has to hit bottom. She has to hit bottom. I talked about the support in Al-Anon, and absolutely it's there, but also I heard a lot in Al-Anon meetings, the same thing. If you try to help them, you are encouraging and allowing their drug use. You just have to weigh all of the reality, which is that drugs are killing our kids, and we want to do everything we can to get them off drugs.
And I think that's where I think having some sort of professional help comes in, right?
Oh, I didn't say that, but you're right. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one of the things to navigate that. Not only were the kids seeing a therapist, but I was seeing a therapist, and that was part of it, as a parent, and part of it was to make decisions like that. What do I do when he calls me up and he tells me on the street and asks me to send him money? What can I say? And it's not just to hang up or to say, or to send money. No, there's a lot of other things you can do. Say, where are you? Let me come meet you. If they're not into that, if they're not willing to do that, keep negotiating. Say, well, I'm going to think about this. Call me back in an hour. It keeps them connected to you. We just don't give up, and we realize that sometimes we need help to make those decisions.
And I'm going to add this, which may be an unpopular opinion. So I think parents have to be healthy and okay with themselves in order to be able to engage with children that are in that place. Because otherwise it is very easy to get sucked into the cycle, to the drama, to the belief that they're going to save them, to engaging in some helping them in ways that isn't really helping, right? You know, a parent needs somebody who is sort of a neutral third party, or who's trained, or who's been through it, to be able to help reflect back to them to try to figure out what to do, because every situation is different. For the parent that needs to completely cut off contact, because maybe that's just what they need to do, there's a parent over here like you that needs to talk every single day and make sure they tell them that they love them. But in order for parents to be able to avoid becoming entangled and enmeshed with that, they have to be healthy. They have to have a good support system.
Therapy, you know, connection with other parents who are going through it. You're absolutely right. And to remember that none of this is black and white, that it is all gray. As you said, everybody is different. So sometimes you do have to, you can't let them come home. And you do risk that there will be a terrible outcome because it's not safe. You just do what you can at that point. And also, you know, let yourself off the hook to realize that there is only so much you can do. And we need support, not only to make decisions about how to help and navigate this, but also how to help ourselves, because the stress on us is over the top. I tell the story in the book that I had a brain hemorrhage in the middle of all this, and I asked the doctor, you know, was it because of my stress in my life, my worry about my son? And he said, well, probably not, but it sure didn't help. But people get sick. You know, we don't sleep, we don't work, we can't function. Again, as I said earlier, we can't take care of our other responsibilities, including our other kids, our relationships, our marriage, our partners, whatever it is, those suffer. So we have to keep a balance and take care of ourselves too.
Absolutely. So we're almost out of time. I have one more question that I think is so important. I can't get to all of them. It's impossible. Maybe we'll have to have a next time. Really briefly, can you try to answer this briefly? Can you address parental anger and disappointment even after the addict is in recovery? How can this be overcome?
Same answer, therapy, support groups. It's totally normal to feel that way. It's like going through a war. We've been through a war, whether it's 1 year, whether it's, you know, for me, it was 10 years. It doesn't end when, you know, when there's a truce, when there's a peace. I mean, even when Nick was sober for, you know, more than a year, 2 years, it happens gradually. And part of it is knowing that it's okay to have those feelings and it's normal to have those feelings, but also to realize that we can get help working through it. And sometimes it might even be therapy with, you know, the person in your life who is addicted, and working together. Also, again, couples therapy, sometimes family therapy. We live in a culture where, again, if we were sick with a physical disease, we'd go to a doctor. But somehow, if we're struggling with something emotionally or mentally, we feel like we have to do it ourselves. We can't. We need help.
Thank you. That was great. Okay. Really fast, because we've got to go almost done. Really briefly, can you tell us in like one sentence, tell us about your new book, The Buddhist on Death Row, because it just came out last week. It's getting amazing reviews. It looks wonderful. Tell us really briefly about that.
It's connected because so many people who are incarcerated also are there because of drugs, their own drug use, or their families. So I found somebody on death row and who's innocent, who grew up in a family of addiction, and rather than doing what most people do who are in a situation like that, becoming angry, bitter, going crazy, killing themselves, he went a different way and he became a Buddhist devoted to helping other people. And so I spent years interviewing this guy and writing about his story as a hopefully another hopeful story for people who are struggling. You don't have to be struggling on death row. You can be struggling in, you know, in our homes, and we all do. And part of it is asking for help. Part of it is, you know, figuring out what works for us. And what worked for him was becoming a Buddhist and meditation.
Well, I'm excited to read it. And I heard a couple people have already read it and they said it was amazing. All right. So I'm so grateful to you for being here and for taking the time. And for what people don't know is that we had some technical difficulties, but we overcame, which is amazing. And thank you for your patience with that. I have to thank one more time our sponsors, Karen Atlanta, Willing Way in Statesboro, and Twin Lakes Recovery Center in Monroe. We're so grateful for their support, and all of our sponsors that graciously made this possible so we could bring you to our community. I want to make sure people know that they can find our organization, HAMSA, at hamsahelps.org. They can call us at 1-833-HAMSA-HELPS. That's HAMSA. They can find us on our agency website at jfcsatl.org. Lots of ways to find us. Don't forget, if you're struggling, the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse Care's Warm Line is available. The Crisis Text Line is available. GCAL is available. Lots of places to go if you need help. We're here. We want to help you. Please reach out and let us know what we can do for you. David, thank you so much for what you're doing for families. If you haven't read these books, I highly recommend. And thank you so much.
Oh, Leslie, thank you so much for doing this and for doing the work you do. When I talk about people getting support, we know where to go.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And just so everybody knows, you will be able to continue to view this. If you want to share it with somebody, it'll be up on our Facebook page and our website for a little while. So we hope you'll share it with the people who need it, and sending lots of love out into the world to everybody who's out there still struggling, and we're here to help. So thank you so much, David.
Thank you again.
Bye.